Some names and details in this story have been changed for the purpose of anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photos were taken at the scene. On October 14, 1999, 7-year-old Ryan Fleming disappeared without a trace during a family picnic in Conkle's Hollow State Park, Ohio. Despite the largest search operation in the history of the county, the boy, who was wearing special orthopedic boots, seemed to disappear into thin air among the high cliffs. The truth about his fate was learned only 11 years later, on October 18, 2010. 10 miles from the place of disappearance, at the bottom of an old farm's tightly welded concrete septic tank, construction workers found a child's shoe that hid a secret more terrible than death itself. October 14, 1999, in Hocking County, Ohio, began as a perfect fall day. The temperature had warmed up to 65 degrees Fahrenheit. The sky was cloudless, and the forests around Conkle's Hollow Preserve were ablaze with red and gold. Famous for its deep gorges and sheer sandstone cliffs rising up to 200 feet, this place has always attracted tourists for its wild beauty. It was here that the Fleming family came to escape the hustle and bustle of the city. 30-year-old architect David, his wife Sarah, and their 7-year-old son Ryan. None of them could have imagined that this sunny afternoon would be the beginning of a nightmare that would last for decades. Ryan was an active and inquisitive child, despite his congenital limp in his left leg. On that day, the boy was wearing a bright yellow windbreaker that was clearly visible against the forest and blue jeans. On his feet, he had special orthopedic boots by Stride Right, with high lacing and thick soles, which helped him to keep his balance on uneven surfaces. His parents always kept a close eye on him, knowing that his foot could easily cause him to trip, especially on the rocky paths of the reserve. According to David Fleming's testimony recorded in the police report, around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the family stopped for a picnic in a small clearing located 50 yards from the start of the popular Rim Trail. The place seemed safe. Open space, minimal shrubbery, good visibility. While his parents were getting a basket of sandwiches and thermoses out of the trunk of their station wagon, Ryan was playing nearby. His attention was drawn to a chipmunk that ran past an old tree stump. The boy, laughing, took a few steps toward the edge of the forest, where dense ferns and old-growth pines began. Sarah Fleming later told investigators that she took her eyes off her son for just a minute to help her husband spread a blanket. When she straightened up and called out for Ryan, the only response was the sound of the wind in the treetops. It was 1 hour and 10 minutes past noon. At first, the parents did not panic, thinking that the boy had simply hid behind a nearby tree, deciding to play a joke. David walked around the clearing, loudly calling out his son's name. But minute after minute passed, and Ryan's yellow jacket did not appear among the gray-brown trunks. The forest, which had seemed friendly a moment ago, suddenly became threateningly quiet and huge. At 2 o'clock and 15 minutes, after an hour of futile searching on his own, David Fleming, out of breath from running, reached the nearest payphone at the park entrance and dialed 911. A dispatcher from the Hocking County Sheriff's Office received a call about a missing child in a high-danger area. The response was immediate. By 3 in the afternoon, the first patrol cars had blocked the exits from the preserve, and by 4 o'clock, 24 rangers and a group of volunteers were on the scene. The search operation took place in difficult terrain. Conkle's Hollow is a maze of narrow gorges and dangerous cliffs. The main version of the rescuers in the first hours was that the child had fallen from a height or been injured. A group of climbers began to descend into the deepest sandstone faults, checking every cavity and niche. However, the gorge was clear. There were no traces of falls, broken branches, or pieces of clothing on the slopes. The situation deteriorated sharply in the late afternoon. The air temperature began to drop rapidly, and the sky was covered with heavy leaden clouds. Around 5:30, it started to rain, cold and drizzling, turning the dry soil into a slippery mess. This was a disaster for the searchers. The water inexorably washed away possible footprints of the child on the rocky parts of the trail. The only hope remained in canine search. The search dogs, who were allowed to sniff Ryan's sweater from the car, were able to pick up the trail. A dog named Buster confidently led the rescuers away from the picnic site through the dense undergrowth. The surprising thing was that the trail did not lead deep into the forest, where the child could get lost, and not to dangerous cliffs. The dog led the group to an old, almost abandoned logging road, Big Pine Road, which ran parallel to the tourist routes, but was hidden by trees. Here, in the middle of a broken track, half a mile from the disappearance site, the dog stopped and began to circle in place, whining miserably. The trail ended abruptly and definitively, as if Ryan Fleming had just been lifted into the air. There were no signs of struggle, blood, or wildlife on the damp ground. Only the prints of small orthopedic boots that went to the road and disappeared. The dog handler noted in the report that such behavior of the dog often indicates that a person got into a vehicle. However, the rain, which was getting heavier by the minute, had already washed away any possible traces of the car's tires, if there were any. The search lasted for 3 weeks without a break. The entire state of Ohio followed the news, and volunteers combed the forest with a chain, checking every bush. Cavers surveyed hundreds of limestone caves and grottos within a 5-mile radius. Ryan's parents, mad with grief, spent the night in their car near the search operation headquarters, hoping for a miracle. But the forest was silent. The case of Ryan Fleming was officially suspended with the wording "disappearance under unexplained circumstances," leaving only emptiness and dozens of unanswered questions. No one paid attention to one inconspicuous fact in the reports. The night Ryan disappeared, only one old maintenance van was driving down Big Pine Road, according to a local forester. Exactly 11 years have passed since that fateful day in the preserve. October 2010 in Ohio was as cool and windy as the year the boy disappeared. Ryan Fleming, if he were alive, would have turned 18 years old. His room in his parents' house had long been empty, and the family itself could not bear the burden of uncertainty and grief. David and Sarah divorced 3 years after the tragedy, unable to look into each other's eyes, where they read a mute accusation. Yet they both continued to live within the state, still hoping for a call that would bring some news. But the news didn't come from detectives. It came from a place no one had ever thought possible. Just 10 miles from the point of disappearance, in the small village of Rockbridge, lost among the hills, life went on as usual. This area has always been considered a quiet one, where neighbors know each other but try to keep their noses out of other people's business. In one of the remote areas, there was an old farm that had been abandoned for the past few years and was gradually overgrown with weeds and wild grapes. In 2010, it had a new owner, Mike Stevens, who planned to restore the farm. The land needed major repairs and clearing. While inspecting his property, Stevens noticed an old sewage system that, according to documents, had not been used since the 90s. The concrete tank, located in the backyard in the dense shade of an old spreading oak tree, looked like a disaster. To dismantle the system, the owner hired a professional team from a local company, Hocking Valley Septic Services. The work began on the morning of October 18, 2010. The weather was cloudy, with occasional drizzle, turning the clay soil into a viscous swamp. The heavy machinery entered the yard at 8 o'clock in the morning. The excavator started digging up the ground around the old concrete ring to get to the utilities. As the bucket of the machine rumbled off the heavy concrete lid of the septic tank, a heavy smell of mustiness and dampness rose into the air. The tank was almost empty. The liquid had long since leaked into the ground through cracks, but a thick layer of silt, dirt, and rotten leaves about 2 feet thick remained at the bottom. According to the foreman's testimony, one of the workers had to go down to clean the drain completely. A man wearing a protective suit and a respirator lowered a ladder into the dark sinkhole. The work was slow. The dirt was thick and sticky. The man was methodically shoveling out the contents with a shovel, loading them into buckets that were being lifted up. Suddenly, the metal blade of the shovel hit something hard. The sound was dull, not like hitting a concrete floor. Deciding that it was a stone or a piece of construction debris, the worker bent down and began to shovel out the black liquid with his hands in thick rubber gloves. A minute later, an inhuman scream broke the silence on the farm. The worker flew out of the pit like a bullet, ripping his respirator off his face. He was shaking. His face was pale as chalk. He refused to speak, only pointed with a trembling hand into the depths of the black well. The foreman, shining his flashlight at the bottom, saw something that made him immediately call the police. Among the black silt was a small, mud-covered child's shoe. It was no ordinary shoe. It was a specialized orthopedic shoe with high lacing and a thick sole that had miraculously retained its shape after years of exposure to the wet environment. Next to the shoe, white fragments could be seen that could not be anything other than human bones. The state police arrived at the scene at 12 o'clock 30 minutes. They immediately surrounded the farm with yellow tape, declaring it a crime scene. A team of forensic scientists in white protective coveralls began work. The procedure for removing the contents of the tank resembled an archaeological dig. Each bucket of dirt was lifted up and carefully sifted through special sieves. The horrifying picture was emerging fragment by fragment. Within a few hours, the experts pulled an almost complete skeleton of a child to the surface. In addition to the bones, they found remnants of clothing in the silt that had not rotted due to the synthetic composition of the fabric. These were fragments of blue denim and a half-rotten bright yellow jacket. The color of the jacket was still distinguishable despite the layer of dirt. It was the same shade that had been described in all the orientations from 11 years ago. But the most frightening discovery awaited the investigators not at the bottom, but in the tank's very structure. When the forensic experts began to examine the neck of the septic tank in detail, they noticed a strange detail. The concrete cover that the excavator had pushed off was only an external protection. Underneath, at a depth of several inches, was a heavy metal sheet that had once blocked the entrance. Upon closer inspection of the edges of this sheet and the walls of the well, the experts found traces of welding. Someone had deliberately welded this entrance many years ago. It was not an accidental fall of a child into an open manhole. It was a carefully planned burial. Traces of rust and scale showed that the welding work was done from inside the old well structure, or in a way that ensured complete tightness, turning the sewer drain into a secure vault. Whoever did this wanted to make sure that Ryan Fleming would never be found. And if it weren't for an accidental repair decades later, this concrete bag under an old oak tree would have kept its secret forever. Now the silent question, "Where is he?" has been replaced by a loud and scary, "Who did this?" Dear friends, before we continue to dive into the details of this gruesome investigation, I want to ask you for one important thing. Please subscribe to the channel click on the bell, and leave any comment below this video. Your engagement is the only way to signal to YouTube's algorithms that this content is worth watching. This is the only way we can spread this story so that as many people as possible can see it, and so that the memory of such events does not disappear. Thank you for your concern, and now let's get back to business. The process of identifying the remains at the Columbus Medical Examiner's office lasted an unbearably long 3 days. For Ryan's parents, who had been living in a state of uncertainty for more than a decade, these 72 hours were the most difficult ordeal. The pathologists worked with great care, realizing the high profile of the case. Since the soft tissues were completely decomposed, dental charts became the main identification tool. A comparative analysis of the panoramic images of the jaw taken a year before the disappearance and the found skull showed a complete match. However, it was not DNA analysis, the results of which would have taken weeks to come back, but the best preserved physical evidence that put the final point in the identification process. Experts cleaned the found orthopedic shoe from a layer of dirt and silt. On the inside of the tongue, under a layer of fossilized clay, they managed to read the individual serial number of the product. An inquiry to the shoe manufacturer confirmed that the pair had been specially made for a patient named Ryan Fleming and issued by the clinic in September of 1999. There were no more doubts. However, the report of the state's chief medical examiner contained information that shocked the detectives far more than the fact of the identification itself. The analysis of bone tissue, including growth zones on the tubular bones and the stage of root formation of the molars, led to an unequivocal and horrifying conclusion. The boy's death did not occur on the day he disappeared. The examination showed that after October 14, 1999, Ryan continued to grow and develop. He was alive for at least 2 years after he was reported missing. This fact turned the entire investigation upside down. This was not a momentary tragedy or accident, but a prolonged, cold-blooded holding of a child in captivity right under the noses of the police. With this information, the investigation team immediately focused on the history of the Rockbridge Farms ownership. Detectives pulled up archived records from the Hocking County land records. The documents showed that from 1999 until 2008, the sole owner of the property was a man named Gerald Cross, who was more commonly referred to locally as Jerry. Cross's identity instantly attracted the attention of investigators because he fit the profile of a suspect who could hide a crime for years without being detected. In the year of Ryan's disappearance, Gerald Cross was 51 years old. He worked as a senior mechanic in the Logan Hocking School District's fleet, which gave him access to technical facilities and tools, and explained his skills in metal handling and welding. But the most disturbing thing was the reputation the man had among his neighbors. Jerry Cross was considered a pillar of the local community. He was a quiet, steady man, a devout member of the local Baptist church, who helped with repairs to the church building and fixed parishioners' cars for free. No one had ever noticed any aggression or suspicious behavior. When the detectives pulled up the old search operation reports from 1999, they were struck with cold horror. Gerald Cross's name appeared on the lists of official volunteers. He was not just watching the tragedy from the sidelines. He was an active participant in the search. The logbook indicated that Cross had been combing the Conkles Hollow forest with the rangers every day for 2 weeks. Moreover, he provided his personal pickup truck to transport the rescuers' generators and lighting equipment. The man who had abducted the child would simulate searching for him during the day, looking into the eyes of the grieving parents and in the evening returned to his farm where he had hidden the boy. The farm where the body was found had an unofficial name among the locals, Tihaya Gavan. It was located deep in the forest, away from the main roads, and was an ideal place to hide any secret. A high fence and dense trees reliably hid the yard from prying eyes. According to realtors, in 2008, Cross unexpectedly put the house up for sale. The deal was made in a hurry, at a price well below the market price, which surprised the real estate agent at the time, but did not raise suspicions. After the sale of Safe Harbor, Gerald Cross did not leave the state. Investigators found out that he moved north to the city of Lancaster, located just 30 minutes away from the scene of his crime. There, he lived the life of an ordinary retiree, continued to attend church, and worked as a night watchman, remaining invisible to the justice system. The police realized that the killer had not fled to Mexico or changed his name. He was right there, confident in his impunity, believing that concrete and metal had safely buried his past. But now that the investigators knew his name and address, there was only one question left. Did he still have anything in his new home that belonged to the missing boy? On October 19, 2010, the investigation into the case of Ryan Fleming entered an active phase. Having received irrefutable evidence of the child's death, detectives from the Hocking County Sheriff's Office, together with agents from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, obtained search warrants for 2 locations at once. The first team went to the city of Lancaster, where the former farm owner lived, and the second, reinforced by technicians and forensic experts, stayed in Rockbridge to scrutinize every square inch of the safe haven territory. The police realized that if the boy was still alive 2 years after his abduction, he had to be kept somewhere. The farmhouse was too small and lacked a substantial basement, and the walls were too thin to hide the presence of a prisoner. Another structure caught the investigators' attention, an old, detached garage workshop that stood 50 yards from the house. This wooden building on a concrete foundation looked massive and was locked with a heavy padlock even after the new owners bought the land. The search began at 11 o'clock in the morning. Experts used ground-penetrating radar to scan the concrete floor of the garage, looking for any anomalies or cavities. The device showed that the soil had an unnatural density under the concrete layer in the northern part of the room, exactly where the heavy workbench had been standing. The scanner screen clearly showed a rectangular outline of emptiness. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the operatives, armed with jackhammers and crowbars, began to break the concrete screed. The work was difficult because the concrete was reinforced with steel mesh, which once again indicated the builder's desire to make the structure as strong and impenetrable as possible. When the concrete layer was pierced, a wooden hatch was disguised underneath, lined with felt for airtightness. Stale, heavy air wafted out of the hole, mixing the smells of mold, old paper, and human despair. What the detectives saw down there made even the most experienced agents of the Bureau freeze. This was no ordinary cellar for storing vegetables or preserves. It was a specially equipped prison. The room measured approximately 6 by 10 feet and had a ceiling height of no more than 5 feet, allowing an adult to stand there only bent over. The walls of this cell were tightly covered with old, dirty mattresses and blankets. It was primitive but effective soundproofing. The cries of the child in this cell were dampened by layers of cotton wool and fabric, having no chance of reaching the surface. The beam of a police flashlight snatched details of the prisoner's life out of the darkness. In the corner was a rusty enamel bucket that served as a toilet. Nearby, on a wooden floor, was a thin mattress without bedding. But the worst thing was the things that surrounded this miserable lair. On a makeshift shelf were children's toys, plastic soldiers, cars, and superhero figures popular in the late 90s. There was also a stack of old comic books, the pages of which were red to the holes and yellowed from the humidity. It was a kind of time capsule frozen in 1999. The ventilation system attracted special attention of the forensic scientists. Gerald Cross, being a mechanic, designed a cunning air exchange system. A 4-inch diameter plastic pipe came out of the basement ceiling, passed under the garage foundation, and exited outside the back wall of the building. The outlet of the pipe was cleverly disguised in the middle of a large stack of firewood that had been in the same place for years. Air was coming in, but it was impossible to see the vent from the outside. On one of the walls, between the joints of the mattresses, the investigators noticed drawings made directly on the concrete plaster with a piece of charcoal. These were primitive, childish sketches that smacked of hopelessness. They depicted a dense forest with unnaturally large, twisted trees that resembled lattices. In the middle of the forest stood a small figure, shaded in charcoal to highlight his jacket. Although the drawing was in black and white, the shape of the clothing unmistakably resembled the same windbreaker that Ryan had disappeared in. The discovery under the workshop finally put the puzzle of the crime together. The detectives realized the cynicism of the situation. While hundreds of volunteers combed the woods, while Ryan's parents cried on TV cameras, and Gerald Cross himself stood next to them in church and held a candle for the boy's return. The child was just a few feet underground in his own backyard. Ryan was alive, breathing through that wood chimney, reading comic books by the light of a dim bulb, waiting for the rescue that never came. The evidence was collected. Toys, comics, and DNA samples from the mattresses were packed in evidence bags. The investigation now had not only the victim's body, but also a crime scene that eloquently testified to a prolonged, planned, and brutal detention. The Rockbridge team radioed the information to their colleagues in Lancaster. The time for gathering evidence was over. It was time to arrest the man who created this hell. On October 20th, 2010, at exactly 6 o'clock in the morning silence on the sleepy outskirts of Lancaster was broken by the sound of the engines of an armored SWAT van. The operation to arrest Gerald Cross was planned with the utmost care. Given the severity of the crime he was charged with, and the uncertainty about whether he had a weapon, the state police decided not to take any chances. The perimeter around the small one-story white siding house was completely blocked by snipers and tactical response team officers. At the time, Gerald Cross was already 62 years old. For the last 2 years after selling his farm, he had lived a reclusive life, working as a night watchman at a lumber yard across town. His neighbors knew him as an unremarkable pensioner who never played loud music, mowed his lawn on time, and hardly ever received visitors. This mask of normalcy that he had worn for decades was about to fall off this very morning. At 6 hours and 5 minutes, the assault team smashed down the front door with a battering ram. Officers burst in shouting, "Police, on the floor!" expecting to see an armed criminal or an attempted escape. However, the picture that appeared before them was quite the opposite, and therefore even more terrifying. Gerald Cross was sitting at a small kitchen table, dressed in a clean, ironed shirt. He had a cup of hot coffee in front of him, still steaming. He made no attempt to resist, did not reach for the drawers, and did not even change his posture. When the handcuffs clicked on his wrists, he just calmly finished his coffee and looked at the officers with the look of a man who had been waiting for this visit for a long time. The search of Cross's home revealed details that vividly characterized the psychological portrait of the kidnapper. The house was in perfect, almost manic order. Each thing had its clearly defined place. There was not a single speck of dust on the furniture, and the clothes in the closet were hung strictly by color. This sterile cleanliness contrasted sharply with the conditions in which he had kept the child for years in a filthy dungeon under the garage. Among the suspect's personal belongings, detectives found an item that became one of the key pieces of evidence and the emotional anchor of the case. In the bedroom, on a shelf above the bed where Cross kept technical literature on mechanics and religious pamphlets, was a small wooden figurine. It was a chipmunk, roughly carved from a piece of pine. The work was clumsy, clearly a child's, with traces of uncertain movements with the cutter. Experts would later confirm that the nature of the carving indicates the hand of a child aged 7 or 8. It was a trophy. A memory of that fateful day when little Ryan ran after a real chipmunk into the woods, towards his fate. Gerald Cross's interrogation began at 10 o'clock in the morning at the county police headquarters. The investigators who conducted the interview noted in their reports the unnatural calmness of the detainee. He was not nervous, did not ask for a lawyer, and did not try to deny his involvement in the disappearance of Ryan Fleming. On the contrary, he spoke about it with a strange confidence, as if he were fulfilling an important mission. Cross's version of events shocked even experienced detectives with its twisted logic. He categorically refused to use the word kidnapping. According to him, on October 14, 1999, he was driving along the forest road, Big Pine Road, returning from work. Suddenly, he saw a boy in a yellow jacket running out of the woods, chasing an animal. Cross claimed he stopped his van and watched the child for several minutes, but no adults appeared. In Cross's mind, this was a turning point. He told investigators that it was a sign from above. In his morbid philosophy, if parents let a child get that far and weren't there at that very second, they had lost the moral right to raise them. God sent me on that road for a reason, he repeated in a monotone voice during the interrogation. He sincerely believed that he had not stolen the child, but had saved her from the negligence of her parents and the depravity of the modern world. Cross told how he called the boy to the car, promising to show him the chipmunk he was trying to chase. The trusting Ryan approached the car of a familiar-looking uncle who often visited the school where he worked as a mechanic. Within moments, Cross stunned the child with a heavy palm strike and threw him into the back of the van. "I gave him a real upbringing," Cross said, looking directly into the interrogation camera. "I taught him humility, work, and the Word of God. I protected him from sin." For him, the 2 years of imprisonment of the child in a soundproof bunker without sunlight was an act of supreme mercy. He did not feel guilty for the broken lives of the Fleming family, considering them sinners who were punished for their inattention. But when the investigator asked a direct question about what exactly happened behind the closed basement door during those long months, and why the rescue ended with the body being concreted in a septic tank, Cross was silent for a moment. A shadow of irritation appeared on his face, as if he had been asked about something obvious and insignificant. His next words made those in the observation room shudder with the realization of what the little boy had gone through before eternal darkness fell. Over the next few weeks after Gerald Cross's arrest, the investigative team, based on his dry, emotionless testimony and the physical evidence recovered from the dungeon, began to piece together the chronology of the horrific 2 years that had passed between Ryan Fleming's disappearance and death. What the detectives discovered was a story not just of physical imprisonment, but of the total psychological destruction of a young child's personality. According to the kidnapper, it all started instantly. On that fateful day on a forest road, he took advantage of the 7-year-old boy's gullibility, stunned him with one precise punch and threw him into the back of his work van. Ryan woke up in complete darkness as the van pulled into the gate of a farm in Rockbridge. Cross had acted precisely according to a plan that he claimed had come to him spontaneously, but had been implemented with the precision of an engineer. He immediately carried the semi-conscious child to a disguised entrance to an underground vault under the garage. Investigators found out that Cross had built this room himself in the early 90s as a tornado shelter, which often frightened Ohioans. It was fortified, self-contained, and most importantly, completely isolated from the outside world. It was here, in a 6-square-meter concrete box, that Ryan's new life, which his captor called rescue, began. The conditions of detention were Spartan. Cross came down to his captive strictly twice a day, in the morning before work and in the evening after his shift. He brought simple food, canned food, bread, water, and sometimes fruit. But along with the food, he brought something more terrible: his distorted reality. Realizing that sooner or later a 7-year-old child would start screaming or looking for a way out, Cross invented a terrible lie that became more secure than any chain for Ryan. In the very first days, he convinced the boy that the world on the surface had ceased to exist. Cross, using his adult authority and religious rhetoric, told the child about the Great Flood that allegedly occurred immediately after he saved Ryan. He methodically, day after day, drilled into the mind of the little prisoner the idea that all people, including his parents, had perished in the terrible water, and that only the Cross farm, which stood on a high hill, remained unharmed. The psychologists who later analyzed the case file stated that the boy had developed deep Stockholm syndrome against the background of severe psychological trauma. Ryan not only believed his captor, he was grateful for his life. This lie explained why the neighbors never heard his cries for help. The boy was terrified of giving away his presence, believing that any noise could attract water from outside that would flood his only shelter. Fear of a non-existent element forced him to sit below the water, below the grass, even when Cross was not around. The daily routine in the dungeon was strict. Cross, considering himself a teacher and mentor, forced Ryan to engage in self-education. He brought stacks of old technical magazines on mechanics and car repair, as well as a Bible. The boy had to memorize whole paragraphs about the structure of internal combustion engines and sections from the Old Testament. In the evenings, he had to recite what he had learned to his jailer. If Ryan made a mistake, Cross did not beat him, but punished him with silence. He could not come down for a day, leaving the child in complete darkness and loneliness, which was worse for a traumatized psyche than physical pain. That's how the first winter, spring, summer, and fall passed. The child's body, deprived of sunlight, vitamins, and normal movement, began to weaken. The dampness that seeped through the concrete walls of the basement slowly but inexorably eroded Ryan's health. The ventilation pipe laid through the firewood could not cope with the humidity, and the mattresses that lined the walls began to mold. The tragic outcome began to brew in the winter of 2001. In January, when the frost in Ohio was particularly severe, the temperature in the unheated bunker dropped to critical levels. Ryan started coughing. At first, it was a mild cough that Cross didn't pay attention to, advising him to pray more. But every day the boy's condition worsened. The cough became deep and barking, and a high fever appeared. The child was on fire, his body shivering on the wet mattress. These were classic symptoms of acute pneumonia, which developed due to hypothermia and constant dampness. In any normal situation, a course of antibiotics and hospitalization could have saved his life in a few days. But Gerald Cross was not guided by logic or mercy, but by an animal fear of exposure. He was well aware that any visit to the doctor, or even a trip to the pharmacy to buy strong medicine for the child, would arouse suspicion. The pharmacist could remember him. The doctor could ask unnecessary questions. His perfectly constructed world, where he was a savior and a god, could be destroyed. So Cross made a fateful decision. He categorically refused to take the dying child to the hospital. Instead of professional help, he began treating Ryan with folk methods. He brought him hot tea with herbs, rubbed some fat on his chest, and most importantly, spent hours praying over him, convincing him that the disease was a test of faith. He watched the boy fade away, his breathing becoming whistling and labored, but his fear of prison was stronger than his pity. One evening, when he went down to the basement, Cross saw that Ryan could no longer lift his head to drink water, and his eyes were glassy and unfocused, staring somewhere through the concrete ceiling. January of 2001 brought record snowfall and freezing temperatures to Ohio. Temperatures dropped to 10 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit at night, turning the forests around Rockbridge into a frozen kingdom of ice. These days, the soundproofed bunker under the garage was silent. The debilitating cough that had plagued Ryan Fleming for the past 2 weeks had stopped. When Gerald Cross went downstairs for his usual evening visit, he realized that prayers and herbal teas had not helped. The 9-year-old boy lay motionless on a damp mattress. His lungs, filled with fluid due to the progressive swelling, had stopped breathing in the stale air of the dungeon. Ryan died alone in the dark, without waiting for the promised water to drop. Cross's reaction to the death of the child he called his pet was devoid of any human emotion. During interrogations, he later admitted that he felt neither regret nor remorse. He felt only cold pragmatism. His mission of rescue was over, and now he was faced with a purely technical task: the disposal of a body that had become dangerous evidence. Cross acted quickly and calculatingly, as if he were fixing a broken mechanism. That same night, he began preparations for the burial. His actions were strange and ritualistic. Instead of getting rid of the clothes in which the boy had been abducted, Cross carefully took them out of the hiding place. He put blue jeans on the cold body, laced up the same high orthopedic stride right shoes, and pulled a yellow windbreaker over his shoulders that had become too small for him in 2 years. He recreated the image of the child he had met on Big Pine Road, as if trying to erase 2 years of exhaustion and illness from his memory. The burial site was chosen perfectly. The old concrete septic tank, located in the backyard in the shade of an oak tree, had not been used for its intended purpose since the early 90s. It was dry, deep, and most importantly, located on private property where no one had access. Cross knew the design of the tank perfectly. On the night of January 15th, a severe blizzard began. The wind was howling so hard that any sounds in the yard were drowned in the noise of the weather, and the thick snow reliably hid the tracks. It was the perfect cover. Cross carried Ryan's body out of the garage, wrapped in a tarp, and carried it 50 yards to the black hole of the sewer well. He dumped the body down into the darkness on a layer of old silt. He followed it with several bags of construction debris, brick fragments, and rusty hardware to hide the outline of the human figure if anyone ever looked inside. But Cross was not going to leave even the slightest chance of detection. Being a professional welder, he prepared a heavy steel sheet cut to the exact size of the inner neck of the well. With the wind howling, lighting his way with only a dim lantern, he descended into the upper part of the shaft and began welding. The sparks from the electrodes went out in the snow swirl. He welded a sealed seam around the entire perimeter of the sheet, turning the concrete tank into a sealed steel vault. He placed a standard concrete lid on top and covered everything with a thick layer of earth and snow. By morning, the snowfall had completely leveled the landscape. The grave disappeared. For the next 7 years, Gerald Cross lived in the house, drinking coffee every morning in the kitchen, which overlooked the old oak tree and the gravesite. He mowed the grass over the septic tank, planted flowers nearby, and continued to go to church, where he sometimes met Ryan's grieving parents. His peace of mind was based on his belief in his own genius. He believed he had created the perfect hiding place. No one would ever look for a missing child in the boiled sewer of a decent citizen. In 2008, when Cross decided to sell the farm and move to Lancaster, he did so not out of fear or remorse. The reason was banal financial difficulties. When he sold Safe Harbor, he didn't even look back at the old oak tree. He was convinced that the secret was brewed so well that it would outlive him, the new owners, and the house itself. He left Ryan there, in the cold concrete, thinking the case was closed forever. But he hadn't taken into account one thing: even metal rusts over time, and the new owners might have renovation plans that would ruin his perfect plan. Now that Cross was sitting in the interrogation room and the boy's body had been found, investigators were preparing materials for the trial, which was supposed to be the final chord of this tragedy, but no one could have predicted how the killer would behave in the face of his victim's parents. The trial of Gerald Cross began in March of 2011 in the Logan County Courthouse. This event became the most high-profile in the history of the county in the last half-century. On the morning of the first day of hearings, the courthouse was surrounded by a tight ring of reporters and local residents demanding justice. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electrifying to the point of tension. The state prosecutor, opening the proceedings, immediately stated that given the extreme brutality of the crime, the length of time the child was tortured, and the cynical concealment of the body, the prosecution would seek the ultimate punishment of the death penalty. In the dock sat a 63-year-old man who did not look like a monster from a horror movie. Gerald Cross was clean-shaven, dressed in a modest gray suit, and looked like an ordinary old man who could feed pigeons in the park. All the while, the prosecutor was reading out the details of the charges: the kidnapping, the 2 years in the dungeon, the death from pneumonia, and the welding on the grave. Cross remained absolutely icy calm. He did not look down, and from time to time even yawned, as if what was happening was tiring him. In the front row, just 10 feet from the killer, sat David and Sarah Fleming. It was the first time in many years that the former spouses had appeared in public together. The shared grief that had once torn them apart had now brought them together again in their quest for justice. They sat holding hands tightly, their fingers white with tension. For them, this trial was not just a legal procedure, but an opportunity to look into the eyes of the man who had stolen their son's future and their lives. The line of defense was based on an attempt to recognize Cross as insane. The lawyer insisted that his client was suffering from a deep religious delusion, that he sincerely believed in his mission of salvation and did not realize the criminal nature of his actions. The defense counsel quoted excerpts from Cross's diaries, where he described his conversations with God about the Great Flood and the need to raise a new generation in isolation. However, this strategy was shattered by a comprehensive forensic psychiatric examination. The state's chief psychiatrist, testifying under oath, stated that Gerald Cross was completely sane. His actions were not chaotic or driven by hallucinations. On the contrary, they were characterized by cold calculation, planning, and logic. The expert characterized the defendant as a person with an extreme degree of narcissism and a complete lack of empathy. His calmness was not a sign of insanity, but a manifestation of absolute indifference to the suffering of others. He knew that he was doing evil, but he believed that he was above human laws. On June 15, 2011, the judge announced the verdict. Given the age of the defendant and the legal nuances of Ohio at the time, Gerald Cross was sentenced to life without parole. The death penalty was commuted to the prospect of dying slowly behind bars, alone with his memories. When the verdict was read, the room erupted, but Cross did not even flinch. He was led away in handcuffs through a side exit, and no one else in Rockbridge saw him. After the trial, the fate of the ominous Silent Harbor farm was decided quickly. The new owners, who bought the land before the body was found, did not want to live in a house with such a history. It was decided to demolish all the buildings. Heavy bulldozers razed the old house where Cross had been drinking coffee while looking at the grave. The garage workshop was dismantled to the foundation, and the underground bunker itself was covered with tons of concrete and earth, burying the dungeon forever. The concrete septic tank was dug up and disposed of. Now the site is just a green field, no different from hundreds of others in Hocking County. Only an old oak tree continues to stand as the only witness to those events. Ryan Fleming's remains were finally given to the earth in a Christian way. He was reburied in a small family cemetery next to his grandparents. The ceremony was attended only by the closest ones. David and Sarah cried, but they were tears of relief. Their boy was no longer in the dark and cold. He was home. A month after the funeral, a memorial bench was erected in Conkle's Hollow Nature Reserve, on the very lawn where the family last saw their son alive. It stands on the very edge, overlooking the majestic pines and the deep gorge. On the back is a small bronze plaque with the inscription, "To Ryan, whose kite now flies above the clouds." Tourists often stop here to rest, not even realizing the tragedy behind the name. The story of Ryan Fleming's disappearance and his double life underground has become a frightening reminder for each of us. We are used to being afraid of dark forests, night alleys, and masked strangers. But the truth is much scarier. Real monsters do not hide in the thickets and do not have fangs. They live among us, in neighboring houses with white fences. They drive the school buses that carry our children. They fix our cars in the repair shops. They smile at us every Sunday in church. And the worst part is that we never know what darkness may be hiding behind that polite smile and what may be hidden under a layer of concrete in their backyard. Take care of yourself and your loved ones.